Why is everything happening to me? You know, we've all probably asked ourselves that at some point. It feels like a simple cry of frustration, right? A question about a string of bad luck. But what if it's something deeper? Today, we're going to unpack that question because it might just be the key to understanding a really profound psychological state, one that can literally shape a person's entire reality. So when that question comes up, it usually comes from a place of just complete exhaustion. But if we look at it from a psychological angle, it isn't really an inquiry. It's not really looking for an answer. Instead, it can act as this incredibly powerful defense mechanism. Think of it like a shield that protects us from something that feels far more frightening than just a run of bad luck. Okay, and before we go any further, it is absolutely crucial to make a distinction here. This is so important. We are not talking about the genuine, real, and often brutal pain of being the victim of an event. That is a real experience. What we're exploring is something different, the mindset of a victimhood identity. See the difference? One is something that happens to you. The other is the lens through which you start to interpret everything that happens to you. So the natural question is, what happens when that lens isn't just temporary? What if it becomes a permanent fixture? Well, that's when it can form what some psychologists call an identity of injury. And it's exactly what it sounds like. A stable, almost constant mindset where your very sense of self becomes defined by being the one who is injured. Let's take a closer look at what that actually means. And this really gets to the core of it. A victimhood identity, it's not just a bad mood or a phase. It's more like a fixed script, a narrative that plays out over and over. And in that story, you are always the one being wronged. But here's the most critical part. An identity like this isn't actually looking for a solution. It's not seeking to heal. What it's really looking for is validation, proof that the script is true. So you have to wonder, how does an identity like this sustain itself? Well, research suggests it's held up by three sort of interlocking core traits. First, there's something called moral elitism. This is the idea that because you've suffered, you have some kind of superior moral standing. Second, there's a lack of empathy. Your own pain can become so big, so all-consuming, that it just eclipses your ability to see or acknowledge the suffering of others. And third, and this one is a big one, is perpetual rumination. And that third trait, rumination, it's so much more than just remembering something bad that happened. It's the obsessive reliving of it. It's like turning past hurts into this continuous mental loop that just plays over and over and over. And you can imagine, each time that loop plays, it just reinforces the feeling of helplessness. It makes that identity of being a victim feel more and more real. It becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. Okay, so we're starting to get a picture of what this identity is. But the deeper question is why? Why does it form in the first place? Let's now dig into the core psychological mechanism that can anchor this entire mindset, really locking it into place. Just think about this for a second. What if you really believed, deep down, that life just happens to you, that you don't really have control, that you're more like a passenger, and your life is just this series of events that you have to endure? Well, this fundamental belief system actually has a name in psychology. It's a concept that was developed way back in the 1950s by a psychologist named Julian Rotter, and he called it locus of control. And really, it's just a way of describing where you believe control or power resides in your own life. Is it inside you or outside of you? And the idea is actually pretty straightforward. If you have an internal locus of control, you generally believe that your own actions determine your outcomes. You know, I did well on the test because I studied hard. But if you have an external locus of control, you believe that outside forces are in charge. I did well because the test was just easy. And that victimhood identity we've been talking about, it is rooted almost entirely in an external locus of control. And here we get to the ultimate tragedy of this identity, the trade-off. Because having an external locus of control, it acts as a kind of psychological shield. It protects the ego. Think about it. If nothing is ever your fault, then you never have to face the pain of failure or the immense weight of responsibility. But what do you give up? You trade your freedom, your potential for growth, all for the false comfort of certainty, the certainty of being blameless. And you know, this mindset often has really deep roots, and it frequently starts in childhood. Imagine a child who experiences repeated, terrible events that are genuinely beyond their control, things like abuse or neglect. Over time, that child can develop what psychologists call learned helplessness. They learn through painful experience that their actions don't change their reality. And so this this cognitive resignation, this giving up, it actually becomes a survival strategy, one that gets carried right into adulthood as a kind of preemptive defense. But that certainty, that psychological shield we talked about, it comes at an immense price. It begins to shape every single aspect of adult life, often in some really destructive ways. So let's take a look at the price of that certainty. You know, one of the most paradoxical consequences is actually self-sabotage. It sounds strange, but if your entire identity is built on this idea of being injured or wronged, then what happens when you succeed? What happens when you start to heal? Well, positive change actually becomes a threat. It challenges the whole narrative. So subconsciously, a person might start to avoid or even destroy opportunities for growth, just to keep that familiar identity intact. Now, to keep this worldview going, the mind needs constant proof. It's always looking for evidence that the world is against it. And this is where something called hostile attribution bias comes in. It's basically a cognitive distortion, a mental shortcut, where you instinctively interpret neutral or even ambiguous actions from other people as being hostile. So a friend running late isn't just a mistake, it's a personal sign of disrespect. A boss giving constructive feedback isn't trying to help, they're attacking you. And you can see how this plays out in daily life, right? Relationships start to suffer because there's this demand for constant emotional maintenance. People are expected to validate the pain, but anytime they offer a solution, it gets rejected with, "You just don't understand." Every obstacle isn't a challenge to be figured out, it's just more proof that the universe is unfair. Eventually, this can lead to a pattern that some therapists call the help-rejecting complainer, someone who constantly pushes away the very care they seem to be asking for. You know, looking at all of this, it can feel pretty heavy, maybe even a little bleak. But the whole point of understanding how a psychological prison is built is to find the key to the door. And this final part of our exploration isn't about answers. It's about the solemn possibility of a choice. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who himself was a survivor of the Holocaust, wrote about this. He observed that even in the most unimaginably horrific circumstances, there was one final freedom that could never be taken away: the freedom to choose how you respond. He said that between what happens to us and how we react to it, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power. And this really distills it all down to two simple but profoundly different questions. The victim identity is completely defined by the question, why me? It's a question that's always looking backward. It demands an explanation from the world. But an identity of agency, well, it's built on a different question, what now? And that question, it looks forward, and it demands a choice from yourself. Ultimately, the path forward isn't about denying that painful things happened. They did. It's about changing the story you tell yourself about them. It's about making that terrifying but also incredibly liberating shift. The shift away from "this was done to me" to a new, quieter, and infinitely more powerful statement. This happened, and I choose the next move.